It started with a gunshot. The sound tore through the quiet, cookie-cutter streets of Maple Grove, sending birds scattering from the well-groomed trees. Porch lights flicked on in perfect alarm, and curtains rustled as sleepy suburban residents peeked out from behind their curtains. Some thought it was a car backfiring. Others thought it was a firecracker. But Frank Dawson, seated in his wheelchair on his front porch, knew better, because, standing at the end of his driveway, wearing a contorted snarl of fury, was Karen Wilkins, the neighborhood's self-appointed ruler of the homeowner association, and she was holding a weapon. Frank sighed, gripping the handles of his wheelchair as he kept his eyes locked on her quivering hands. She had lost it. Completely all over. A mailbox, a wheelchair ramp, and a flagpole that was allegedly 2 inches taller than homeowner association regulations allowed. It had been months of hostile notes, penalties, threats, and outrageous accusations. But this was a whole new level of insanity. "Step down from your porch right now," Karen yelled, waving the gun wildly as if Frank, who physically couldn't step anywhere, was just being defiant. A porch light from the house across the street flicked on, and a voice called out, "Karen, what the heck are you doing?" Karen didn't react. Her glassy eyes stayed locked on Frank. "This is my neighborhood," she roared, "and I will not let you ruin it with your. She motioned toward his front yard as though struggling to find the words your disrespect. Frank didn't move. He knew better than to antagonize someone whose last 2 thoughts were clearly being held together by malice and a bottle of discounted Chardonnay. "Karen," he said, keeping his voice steady, "you just discharged a gun over a homeowner association violation." Karen stared. Then, as if realizing for the first time what she had done, she looked at the gun in her hand. Her wild energy flickered for a second, then it came back stronger. "You think you can just roll in here, literally, and ignore the rules? You think you're privileged?" Frank let out a short, shocked laugh. "Karen, in a wheelchair because I got wounded defending this country. I'm not exactly out here throwing gatherings and leaving my Christmas lights up all year. You violated homeowner association policies," she screamed. "The flagpole is too high and your mailbox is the wrong shade of beige." "Frank," sighed Karen, "you need help. Serious help." The flashing red and blue lights of approaching police cars reflected off the flawless driveways of Maple Grove. The neighbors, now fully awake, and gathered on their lawns, whispering and recording the scene with their phones. The toy queen had finally lost her power. But this wasn't how it started. No, this was just how it ended. Months ago, when Frank first moved into the neighborhood, he thought Maple Grove was a dream come true. It had spacious sidewalks, a beautiful community park, and well-maintained homes. It seemed like the perfect place for someone who wanted a quiet, peaceful life. What he didn't realize was that the entire neighborhood was under the iron-fisted rule of one woman, Karen Wilkins, the self-proclaimed guardian of the neighborhood's prestige. And as it turned out, Karen didn't take kindly to new residents who didn't fall in line, especially not ones like Frank. The first time he met her, she had marched up to his house, holding a clipboard like it was a sacred relic. She introduced herself with a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Welcome to Maple Grove," she had said. "I run the homeowner association here. We have very strict standards." Frank, sitting on his front porch, had nodded. "Good to know." Her smile stiffened. "I noticed your ramp. That wasn't in your original house design." Frank had blinked. "Well, yeah. It's a wheelchair ramp. It's not homeowner association approved," she had said, tapping her clipboard. "You'll need to submit a request for modifications." Frank had stared at her for a long moment. "Are you seriously telling me I need permission to install a ramp so I can enter my own home?" Karen had crossed her arms. "Rules are rules." Frank, a man who had survived actual war zones, had resisted the urge to laugh in her face. Instead, he simply said, "I'll keep that in mind," and wheeled himself inside, leaving her standing there like a glitching robot. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't over. The next few weeks, the fines started arriving, slipped under his door, left in his mailbox, emailed at 3 a.m. Each one was pettier than the last. The flagpole was too high. The ramp didn't blend with the neighborhood's aesthetic. His trash bins were left out 15 minutes too long on pickup day. First Frank ignored them, then when Karen escalated to leaving passive-aggressive notes taped to his front door, signed with her name in bold, underlined letters, he started pushing back. He sent her legal documents proving that his ramp was protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act. He ignored the nonsense about the mailbox and flagpole, and when she tried to fine him for having a non-regulation garden hose, he laughed in her face. That was when Karen's obsession turned personal. She started watching him, not just casual neighborhood glances, but real unsettling surveillance. Neighbors mentioned seeing her parked outside his house, clipboard in hand, taking notes. One even joked that she might start measuring his lawn with a ruler. Then one night, Frank heard a creak outside his house. Checking his security cameras, he saw Karen sneaking onto his property with a wrench the next morning. His wheelchair ramp was unstable. Some bolts had been loosened. Frank had barely managed to keep from rolling down the porch steps. That was when he knew Karen wasn't just an annoying homeowner association enforcer. She was dangerous. So he set up a GoPro on his wheelchair, documenting every interaction, every time she approached him, every time she harassed him, every ridiculous fine she tried to enforce. It was all recorded. And then, at the annual community barbecue, Frank finally had enough. Standing in front of the whole neighborhood, he called her out. "Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to take a moment to appreciate our beloved dictator. Homeowner Association. President Karen Wilkins." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Karen, standing by the grill with a glass of wine, turned bright red. "Karen here has spent the last few months making my life a living hell because she thinks my wheelchair ramp ruins the aesthetic of the neighborhood. But let's give credit where it's due. She is truly dedicated to her job. Who else would sneak into a veteran's yard at night just to tamper with his mobility aid?" Gasps. More laughter. Karen's jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might shatter. "That's a lie," she screamed. "You're ruining this neighborhood." Frank raised an eyebrow. "Karen, do you know what happens when you tamper with someone's property?" "Because I do, and so does the police department." Silence fell. Karen stormed off, but Frank knew it wasn't over. He had embarrassed her, and people like Karen didn't take humiliation well. He just didn't expect her to show up at his house with a gun. Now, as the police pulled up to his driveway and Karen stood paralyzed, realizing she had finally crossed a line she couldn't step back from, Frank exhaled. This wasn't how he imagined his peaceful retirement, but at least it made for one hell of a story. The aftermath from the gunshot was instant. Maple Grove, a place where the biggest concern was usually whether the neighbor's lawn was cut at the exact regulated length, had officially turned into a crime scene. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cars reflected against the spotless driveways. As Karen Wilkins stood frozen still, gripping the gun like it was an extension of her authority. Neighbors were out in full force now, their sleepy confusion quickly replaced by the excitement of witnessing the Great Homeowner Association meltdown. In suburban history, phones were out, cameras rolling, and hushed whispers filled the air. Frank Dawson sat in his wheelchair, his pulse steady despite the situation he had faced. Worse, a self-important suburban dictator with a gun wasn't nearly as terrifying as what he had survived overseas. But that didn't mean he wasn't furious. After months of petty nonsense, escalating harassment, and now an actual firearm being fired in his direction, he was done playing nice. The police rushed in, demanding Karen drop the weapon. She hesitated as if debating whether homeowner association rules somehow outrank state law, then let it fall onto the ground. She immediately launched into damage control, her voice trembling but still dripping with the same arrogance that had caused this disaster in the first place. "This is a misunderstanding," she blurted out. I was just trying to protect the neighborhood. He's been violating regulations, the homeowner association. The flagpole, the mailbox, the trash bins." One of the officers, clearly unmoved, held up a hand. "Ma'am, do you understand? You just fired a gun over a homeowner association complaint." Karen's jaw dropped, but no words came out. She looked around desperately searching for support, but the neighbors were still recording, still watching. Nobody came to her defense, even the few people who usually nodded along to her nonsense were backing away, pretending they didn't know her. Frank cleared his throat, drawing attention back to him. "She's been harassing me for months," he said, firmly, "damaging my property, issuing false fines, and now attempted intimidation." With a gun, Karen whirled toward him. "You did this," she shrieked. "You've been trying to destroy me from the moment you moved in. You ignored the rules. You made a joke out of me at the barbecue. You made a joke out of yourself." Frank cut in. "I just pointed it out." The officer sighed and turned back to Karen. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us." Karen's face paled. "No, you can't do this. I am the homeowner association president. This is my community. I have a right to enforce the rules." Frank rolled his eyes. "Pretty sure the law ranks higher than the homeowner association handbook." As the police led Karen toward their squad car, she struggled and wailed, spewing every possible excuse. She claimed she was set up. She claimed Frank had provoked her. She even accused the neighbors of conspiring against her, as if they had somehow collectively forced her into grabbing a gun and storming down the street. When she was finally forced into the police car, the silence that followed was almost as loud as the gunshot had been. The neighbors stared at one another, processing what had just happened. The suburban dictatorship of Karen Wilkins had officially collapsed. Frank let out a slow breath. It should have felt like a victory, and in many ways, it was. But something in his gut told him it wasn't over. The next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing. The local news had gotten hold of the story, plastering Karen's mugshot across the screen with headlines that would have been comical if they weren't so absurd. Homeowner Association president opens fire over trash cans and suburban tyrant loses it over mailbox conflict were just a few of the jokes circulating online. Karen had officially become a meme, her name flooding Reddit forums, Facebook groups, and even late-night talk shows. But while the rest of the world was mocking Karen, wasn't done fighting. Even from behind bars, she managed to gather a few of her last remaining supporters. Her inner circle of busybodies, 2 older women and a man named Greg, who had always sided with her just a little too eagerly, started spreading rumors she was set up. They insisted Frank manipulated her into losing control. "She was just trying to protect the neighborhood," Greg argued. "She wasn't going to actually harm anyone. She'll be back," one of the old ladies muttered ominously. "She's not done." Frank didn't take any of it seriously at first. Karen was facing several charges: firing a weapon in a residential area, reckless endangerment, and unlawful intimidation. She was looking at severe legal consequences, not a slap on the wrist. But as the days passed, he started noticing odd things. The fines from the homeowner association kept arriving in his mailbox. Even though Karen was gone, someone was still trying to enforce her ridiculous rules. Notes appeared on his door, in the same forcefully polite language she had used. Per homeowner association guidelines, your wheelchair ramp must be removed or repainted to meet neighborhood aesthetics. Frank crumpled the paper in his fist. He had thought Karen was the issue, but maybe the problem was bigger than just one woman. A week later, an emergency homeowner association meeting was scheduled. Frank debated skipping it, but curiosity got the better of him. When he arrived, he was greeted by the sight of Karen's last remaining supporters standing at the front of the room, attempting to regain control. Greg, looking far too excited for someone defending a maniac, cleared his throat. "We, the acting board members, want to discuss the recent incident involving Mrs. Wilkins." The murmurs in the room were not friendly. "She tried to kill someone," someone muttered. "She lost her sanity," another whispered. Greg raised his hands. "We understand there were mistakes. However, this is a reminder that the homeowner association rules still apply, and in light of recent events, we're considering adding additional security measures to ensure compliance." Frank had to laugh at that. Security. Hence what? People daring to have the wrong shade of mailbox. Greg frowned. "It's about maintaining order." Frank leaned forward in his wheelchair. "Let me be clear. If any of you try to continue the nonsense Karen started, I will personally see to it that this homeowner association gets investigated for harassment. I have footage. I have documentation. And unlike Karen, actually understand how laws work. Greg turned pale. The other board members shifted uncomfortably. Then a voice from the back of the room spoke up. I motion to dissolve the homeowner association. Heads turned. A man stood up, holding a thick binder of documents. There's a process for disbanding a homeowner association. If we get enough votes, we can shut this circus down. Permanently murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Greg's face twisted. You can't do that, the man smirked, pretty sure the law ranks higher than the homeowner association handbook. The meeting turned chaotic after that. Neighbors who had lived in silent frustration under Karen's rule for years were suddenly confident. Discussions erupted about voting out the entire board, about legal action, about finally getting rid of the ridiculous fines and regulations that had been Karen's obsession. By the time the meeting ended, one thing was clear. Karen's reign of terror was officially over. Frank left the meeting with a rare sense of satisfaction. He had come to this neighborhood looking for peace, and while it had taken a gunshot, an arrest, and an attempted homeowner association coup, he was finally getting it. As he rolled up his driveway, he noticed a final note taped to his door, scrawled in hasty, almost desperate handwriting. Read, "You think this is over, but I will be back." Frank shook his head, chuckled to himself, and crumpled the note in his fist. Not if he had anything to say about it. The video of Karen's meltdown spread like wildfire. It wasn't just a neighborhood could scandal anymore. It had become a national joke. News outlets picked up the footage, running dramaticreenictus with exaggerated vice divordidistavi exploded with memes dissecting every second of Karen's absurd downfall. People photoshopped her face onto movie posters, turning her into the villain of her own homeowner association horror film. Late-night comedians took turns mocking her, playing clips of her screeching about flagpoles and trash bins, while the audience seared with laughter. Frank sat back in his wheelchair, sipping his coffee, as he watched the spectacle unfold on the news. He had spent years in the military witnessing real conflictorate, and yet here he was, the center of a suburban war that had escalated beyond anything he could have predicted. He didn't plan on becoming famous, but apparently, standing up to a power-hungry home-owner association was enough to make you a household name. The fallout was brutal for Karen. Her job fired her immediately, not wanting to be associated with a woman who pulled a gun over mailbox. Aesthetics. Her husband, a quick-exhausted-looking man who had spent years in the background of her tyranny, finally had enough and filed for divorce. Her kids, embarrassed beyond belief, deleted their social media accounts and refused to acknowledge her existence. She was evicted from the house she had once controlled, over the very home where she had dictated every tiny detail of her neighbors' lives. The homeowner association, desperate to recover what little credibility it had left, formally removed her as president and stripped her of any remaining authority. But Karen wasn't the type to go down silently. Even as her world crumbled around her, she refused to admit defeat. She posted bizarre rants online claiming she was the real victim, that she had been set up by an anti-group conspiracy. She insisted that Frank had been sent to Maple Grove to ruin everything she had built. Her last desperate attempt at saving face was a live-streamed video where she sobbed dramatically, reading a letter from the homeowner association begging her to return. Unfortunately for her, the Interni Borhad was quick to expose the fact that she had written the letter herself. Frank didn't feel sorry for her, not after everything she had done, not after she had tried to sabotage his ramp, tried to embarrass him, and finally tried to threaten him with a gun. He had dealt with a lot of things in his life, but there was one thing. He couldn't stand bullies who believed they were above sequences. One day, about a month after Karen's arrest, Frank received a letter in the mail. At first, he assumed it was just another leftover homeowner association notice, but when he opened it, he realized it was something much better. The bank had foreclosed on Karen's house, and it was being listed for auction. Frank laughed, a deep, genuine laugh. The opportunity was too perfect. With a little help from a lawyer friend, Frank placed a bid on the house. It wasn't particular licksbeans. Karen had drained herself financially with legal fees, and no one in the neighborhood wanted to go near the place after what had happened. So with minimal effort, Frank became the proud new owner of Karen's Former Kingdom. The news spread fast. The neighbors were thrilled. The idea that the man Karen had tormented for months now owned her house was poetic justice at its finest. There was a celebration, complete with a barbecue, where people took turns screenacting her biggest meltdowns. But Frank had one final surprise in store. A week after moving in, he put up a massive ezig in front of the Husethi former home of Karen Wilkins. Homeowner Association tyrant. Never forget, it was a masterpiece of pettiness, and the neighborhood loved it. People stopped to take pictures, some even bringing their dogs to pose in front of it. The local news covered the story, interviewing journalist who gleefully recounted every ridiculous rule she had tried to enforce. But the best moment came when Karen herself, now living in a rundown apartment on the other side of town, drove by to see it. She screeched to a halt in front of the house, her face twisted with horror. Frank, sitting comfortably on the porch with a drink in hand, gave her a casual wave. She stormed out of the vehicle, looking like she was about to explode. "You think this is hilarious?" she screamed, marching up the pathway. Frank nodded. "Oh yeah, funniest thing I've seen in ages. You destroyed me," she spat, her hands trembling. "I lost everything because of you." Frank's grin faded. He leaned forward slightly in his wheelchair. "No, Karen, you lost everything because of yourself. I just endured it." Karen's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. She was accustomed to getting the last word, used to controlling every situation. But this time, she had nothing. She had already lost. After a long, awkward pause, she turned on her heel and stomped back to her car. Frank watched as she sped away, tires squealing. The neighborhood collectively exhaled. It was finally over. In the following weeks, the homeowner association itself was officially dissolved. The neighbors, tired of pointless fines and endless restrictions, voted overwhelmingly to shut it down. It turned out that without Karen's iron grip, nobody actually cared about the rules she had once enforced with an iron fist. Trash cans could be left out as long as people wanted. Lawn gnomes made a glorious return. The mailbox police were officially retired. Maple Grove, for the first time in years, was truly peaceful. Frank enjoyed every moment of it. He had moved to the neighborhood, looking for a quiet life. And now, he finally had it. He had a community that supported him, a home that was truly his. And best of all, the satisfaction of knowing that the self-proclaimed queen of the homeowner association had been dethroned for good. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset, one of his neighbors came up and handed him a beer. "You know," the man said, grinning, "still can't believe you actually bought her house." Frank smirked. "Best investment I ever made." The neighbor chuckled, raising his bottle in a toast to the fall of the Maple Grove dictatorship. Frank clinked his bottle against his into never dealing with the homeowner association again. They drank, watching as kids rode their bikes freely as families chatted, without fear of being reported for minor infractions, as the neighborhood finally felt like a home instead of a prison. Frank had faced worse battles in his life, but this one, this suburban war, was one he would never forget. And as he sat back, taking in the peaceful evening, he knew one thing for sure: Karen Wilkins would never, ever step foot in Maple Grove again.